Hello and welcome. My name is Joe O'Mara. I'm the Head of Aviation Finance with KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and Airline Economics, I'm delighted to be joined by Betsy Snyder. Betsy is a director with Standard & Poor's and will be well known to those in the aviation finance space. I should say that we are recording this 4 days before Christmas, Betsy. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, do you want to tell our watchers a little bit around your role in covering aviation?
Sure. Okay, so I've actually been at S&P. It'll be going on 32 years in March, and I've been involved with aviation that whole time. I am the primary analyst for the aircraft leasing sector globally at S&P, but I'm also involved with airlines. And even though we have different teams throughout the world, we still are involved with the global airlines, and we primarily in the US, we focus on the US airlines. But as I said, we do work on airlines globally with our counterparts around the world. And I'm also actively involved with our aircraft ABS colleagues as well, and work with them on those transactions.
Right. Thanks, Betsy. I'm sure we're going to touch on lots of those areas as we go through today's chat. Maybe the first on that kind of airline outlook, obviously that's the customer basis for all the lessors. We've seen a pocketed recovery, but it is a bit pocketed and there's a lot of uncertainty there. As you look at the challenges that the aircraft lessors are having with their airline customers, what's your outlook over how things have moved over 21 and where you think they'll go in 22?
Sure. Well, initially when we in the spring of 2020, when COVID first hit, we looked at all the airlines because we thought that there would be a greater impact on the airlines. And then we took rating actions on the airlines themselves. Then we looked at the aircraft lessors and we kept the ratings, but we revised outlooks on many of them to negative from stable. And over time, I guess starting in 2021, we saw that the impact on the aircraft lessors was not as bad as we had expected. Certainly not like the airlines, which we did take several downward rating actions on them, certainly on their cash flow, the impact on their cash revenues and cash flow generation, and also their liquidity. And they actually, as we all know, the airlines were forced to raise a lot of liquidity during the pandemic. I shouldn't say during the pandemic, since it seems to be ongoing and never ending. But in 2020, they were forced to raise a lot of liquidity, use a lot of their assets as collateral, came up with new collateral, such as the frequent flyer programs. And they were able to raise money, and they were actually, in the US at least, they were given a lot of government aid in terms of payroll support, as well as some funding in terms of loans. On the other hand, the aircraft lessors, which we thought would be impacted a lot more by what was going on, and it turns out that they were not impacted as much as we had thought. The revenues, they certainly had exposure to a lot of airlines that went bankrupt or that shut down, but they were aided by some other things. And let me just say that the revenue impact was not as bad as we had expected. The cash flow was not as bad as we had expected. And the debt levels were not as bad as we had expected. Now, the reason for the debt levels was because they cut back, a lot of the aircraft lessors cut back on their capital spending. Now, they were able to cancel, defer aircraft deliveries, but at the same time, the manufacturers cut back on their production. So they were not able to take delivery of as many aircraft as they had expected. So as a result, there was less need for debt to finance that level of CapEx that we had expected. Now, one of the other things that helped their cash flow was they were very active in the capital markets, similar to the airlines. However, they were able to primarily raise unsecured debt and at very low pricing. So their interest costs were much lower than expected. And that actually helped the level of, that's why cash flow was better than we had expected. So their credit metrics turned out to be better than expected. And what we did do was we started earlier this year, and we started to look at outlooks again. And then we did revise most of the outlooks. Well, I shouldn't say most, there were outlooks that we had revised from, for the most part, from stable to negative. Most of those did go back to stable. And there were a few exceptions. There were some aircraft lessors that they had some very large upcoming maturities, and they were not able to refinance those like the larger lessors were. And they were involved in what we call distressed debt exchanges. And those were Voyager and Aviation. And those had been rated the lowest among our aircraft lessors to start with as well. So so those two we no longer rate Voyager. But the other aircraft lessors we did revise the outlooks back to stable. And we just finished our last one, which was Avalon, just a few weeks ago. That was the last outlook that we revised back to stable. For the most part, we had revised them back with the exception of Avalon and AerCap. And AerCap, we waited more until the acquisition of GCAS to see how that would be, if they would be able to raise financing on that. And they most certainly were, being able to raise 21 billion of unsecured debt. And I heard they had demand for over 75 billion. So at that point, we thought that they would be able to finance it, and we revised and also the company has talked about deleveraging after the acquisition, and we've seen them do that before with the acquisition of ILFC back in 2014. So we did revise their outlook back to stable in late October. And then Avalon more recently, when we felt more comfortable that the new investor coming into the H&A Airlines would be able to, things were looking better, that they had decided that they would affirm all of the aircraft that they were leasing, and they would expect to start receiving payments on some of the lease payments that they had not been receiving since COVID started. So we felt more comfortable about that. And so now we pretty much have stable outlooks on all of our aircraft lessors. We did not downgrade any of them with the exception of the two that I mentioned. And we actually had a new rating a few months ago on Castle Lake, which also has a stable outlook.
And a lot to unpack in there, Betsy. Can I pull up one thread, which is around those unsecured issuances? So as you say, market kind of reopened second half of 20, but then from the start of this year, it's been very impressive issuances. Parking AerCap, I think it was 11 billion in H1. Then you had the AerCap transaction, all of which are near historic lows. What do you think that speaks to? There's obviously an abundance of capital in the market, but does it speak to the sophistication and I suppose the desirability of aviation finance debt?
I think that it's become, well, there's a few factors here. I think that it's a lot different than the equity market because you really only have a handful of public companies, whereas the debt capital markets are much deeper. And I think that with AerCap having a much larger debt position, that's probably opened it up to more investors than there were before. But I think also if you look at The ABS market has been very strong this year. It's come back. There's been several issuances of ABS transactions. I think you have some new investors, and I also think that you have new investors in terms of private equity, hedge funds, companies like that, that are basically, there's some new entrants, I should say, in terms of leasing. They're acquiring portfolios. The market for aircraft sales has picked up. That was dead in 2020. Nobody was buying aircraft because the lessors did not want to sell at distressed prices. And but now that's picked up too. So I think you have some new entrants in terms of private equity putting capital in, and I also think you have some new institutional investors in here as well, and that's what's driving the market.
But to that point then around, do you expect the ability of IG rated lessors? I mean, if you take it as a given that we're going to move into an increasing interest rate environment, most likely over the next 12 months, do you think aviation finance, the IG rated lessors, will still maintain the types of spreads they're getting at the moment into the foreseeable future?
Well, I would expect that the cost of their borrowing to increase just like everybody else, but also keep in mind that a large component of their lease rates is driven by interest rates. So I would think where they can, they will pass those along in terms of higher interest rates. Now, it's my understanding a lot of these lease restructurings that have happened that even though they did enter into some new leases at lower rates, their preference was to go on a shorter term basis, just for this very reason. So if demand recovered and if interest rates picked up, they would be able to raise their lease rates.
And now, see, when you've been moving from, as you say, moving back to stable ratings, you're probably, I assume you're factoring in that future outlook on interest rates, and ultimately they should be able to manage it, as you say.
Yeah, and as I said, I still expect the interest rates are going to increase, but I don't think it's going to be, they're going to spike up. I think it's probably going to be on a gradual basis.
Which totally logically follows kind of the Fed putting out with their, the 2 or 3 rate raises.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Over the course of 22. And to pick up on your ABS point, have you been surprised at the pace of return? I know we're not really there fully on the equity side on ABS, but the debt piece has been nearly as as popular as it was in 2019. Have you been surprised at how quickly that's bounced back?
Actually, yes. And some of the names that have been out there have been some of the names that I don't know how to put this delicately. Some names that you might not have expected to.
Not household names, we might say.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have you've had some by the bigger lessors, but it's been more second tier lessors who have been in the market, and a lot of them have been refinancing some transactions that they did earlier. But I think it's kind of interesting that in these ABS transactions, they've been focused on the US airlines. They like to tout the fact that Delta has several aircraft in the portfolio, or airlines like that, which you didn't really, I think that the diversification might not be as much as it was before in these transactions, and it's maybe more away from some troubled geographic areas in the airlines are in those parts of the world. Everybody loves US airlines these days.
Well, they have a domestic market, right? And that's obviously clearly part of it. Have you noticed, and I know it's your probably primary, but your team that's there, other fundamental changes to ABS, as you said, probably an improvement of portfolio quality and airline credit in the newer deals that we've done. Any other structural changes you've seen from the ABS, or is it give or take the same product, albeit not a tradable E-note as of yet?
No, I haven't really seen any changes since 2019. I think it's more just on the airlines themselves. And I was going to say that some of them tend to have fairly newer aircraft that maybe we've seen before. But then there's also some that have there's been some transactions that have some older aircraft. So I haven't really seen that much in the way of changes.
Yeah, no, I think that follows and holds, right? What we've seen, as you say, the newer ones, because some of them being debt plays, they're really just freeing up warehouse. You take the Sky Slam transaction was obviously
Right,
very new portfolio,
yeah,
but all it was doing was freeing up the warehouse that they had, so
right,
it's
yeah,
using that debt mechanism. I think
yeah.
how that equity market returns in ABS will be the one to watch over the next kind of 12 months. Will be pretty interesting. Can I ask you maybe at a helicopter level? Betsy, we've seen leasing for the reasons we've chatted about, airline distress, additional debt, balance sheet liability side ballooning, that leasing has become more popular for airlines, or as you talk, selling down assets, right? Sale and lease backs with your existing assets. So we've seen that probably 50% threshold be breached. Some of the lessors, unsurprisingly, would be hugely bullish about where that goes, 55, 60% of aircraft being leased. What are your thoughts on where that goes from here and how sustainable a higher number is in the percentage of leased aircraft?
Well, I heard a statistic that in 60% of 2021 deliveries went to the aircraft lessors. Um, I, I think that maybe over the next few years it could go to, no, I think maybe 60% is probably the peak. I don't see it going higher than that. I mean, keep in mind that the airlines, once they begin to recover, and their liquidity position is improved, I think they'll be back to ordering aircraft again. I mean, we've seen this with United, who placed the big aircraft order, and so I think you'll start to see more airline deliveries, and I think also airlines will start to pay cash again for their airlines once they're holding huge cash positions now, and at some point they're not going to need those once they see that the situation is improved. So I think the airlines will be buying more of the aircraft themselves. But having said that, I still think there's a lot of opportunities out there for the aircraft lessors. And I think one of the reasons is when you look at ESG, that's become such an important factor now. I mean, that's all everybody talks about with aviation. And I think when you look at the order books that the aircraft lessors have, they're all new generation, more fuel efficient aircraft. And those are the ones that the airlines are going to want. And so the aircraft lessors are probably going to be the only game in town for a lot of airlines. And so I think that's going to help demand on the lessor side.
Can I ask you on the ESG piece? I fully acknowledge and appreciate it's definitely talked about. It's the biggest global issue we have, and it's going to be a massive issue in aviation. Mm-hmm. It is a massive issue in aviation. For lessors now, do you think it's actually having an impact? One, on their ability to raise funds, or two, what they're seeing on the equity side?
I don't think yet it is. And I don't really, excuse me, I don't really think it has been so much on the airline side either. I think we're new into this. I know there's been some green sustainability debt issuances out there, but it's my understanding that the pricing was not all that much different than you saw. The problem is that there's really no substitute out here at this point in time for a next generation aircraft. There's certainly a lot of experimenting going on, sustainable fuels, different types of fuels. But in terms of the next big game changer, there's really nothing out there, and I don't know when that's going to happen. the engine manufacturers, the OEMs, they're going to have to work on an entirely new aircraft type, and I think they have their hands full now just with what they've gone through over the last 2 years. And actually, when you think about it, they have to get production up to speed. I mean, look at Boeing's problems with the 787, that they haven't delivered one for what, it's been over a year. So they have their hands full with just what's on their plate now before I'm sure they're thinking about this, but it's also very capital intensive. And so it's going to take a while for them to build up their balance sheets, to really be investing in some of these new technologies.
Yeah, and that's kind of consistent. I think in the conversations we're having with lessors, a lot of it, not now. There's so much capital out there, it's not hitting you on the debt side. And on the equity side, look, I think you need to manage your shareholder definitely, and clearly that ESG piece will be a very important part of that. I think you're right. From a technology perspective, SAF is probably where they're going to be for the next decade. But what happens in relation to whether or not you'll be able to fund narrow body new tech slightly better, right? Because it's greener, although aviation will never be green. Can I take you back, Betsy, maybe to another kind of helicopter point, which is when you're assessing, when you now have AirCap, which is such an outlier. So you have one buys number two, they've got 2,000 aircraft, and probably Avalon is there at whatever it is, 600 or 700 aircraft.
Yeah, they became number two.
Yeah, like this, not the way Donald wanted, right? And in what way are you assessing, or are you assessing the big players differently? Is there a difference between top 10 scale and AirCap super scale?
I don't think so. And I mean, well, we had AirCap and GCAS before, and they were much bigger than the other ones that tended to be, for the most part, 200 to 400 aircraft in their portfolios. And then you had Avalon at about 600. I think that they can all compete successfully. I mean, Avalon, even though they're AirCap, even though they're around 2,000 aircraft, that's still a relatively small part of the entire market. And it also depends on what availability lessors have of the different aircraft that airlines want when they can get them. So there's, what kind of deals that they can make. So there's a lot of different factors at play. So I don't think the larger lessors are at, the more mid-tier lessors are at a disadvantage. But what I do, I think the smaller ones, if you think about some of these startups that happened in the Chinese lessors and some of these other smaller participants that started up, and I think that they're the ones who are going to be at a disadvantage, and there could be some consolidation opportunities among them. But I think that I don't see the top 10 or the top 15 mid-tier lessors at mid-size, I should say, not mid-tier, mid-size aircraft lessors at a disadvantage.
Yeah, and as you said, that logically holds, right? If you're big enough to price a reasonable order book and tap the IG market, I take your point on the kind of below that piece. If you're not IG rated, I think it's just more challenging at the moment, right? On the debt side and competing from a pricing perspective. You mentioned that consolidation piece. We've obviously couple of rumored deals, right, that may or may not happen over the next kind of month or so. Do you think we'll see more of that? Do you think, as you say, that opportunity piece? It's funny when you look at the top 20 and you try to say, well, who could you buy? You're obviously thinking on the shareholder side. I'm not sure many would sell, right? So I'm just wondering, will we see more consolidation than maybe the couple of deals that we know are out there at the moment?
Yeah, there could be some consolidation. I don't think it's going to be done for platform reasons, because most of the rumored buyers already have their own platforms, so they don't need the platforms of the rumored sellers. The speculation is that maybe they're buying them. There could be some consolidation, especially among the narrow body participants, the lessors that tend to focus on narrow body aircraft and that have narrow body orders, because that seems to be where the demand is these days, especially for leisure, short haul traffic. And there's some talk that there could even be a shortage of narrow bodies over the next few years. So I think maybe that's what's driving some of the consolidation here. But I think, and it's going to be interesting because at the one hand, you have some of these smaller participants who are having trouble getting access to capital, but then you also have all this new entrant money that I talked about, and they're starting to build up portfolios. So there's somewhat of a disconnect here, unless there's more of a consolidation, continuing consolidation among the smaller participants.
Yeah, no, I think really interesting, as you say, right? You've got the private equity backed kind of new platforms that have aggressive targets of adding 1 billion, adding 2 billion, right, over 12, 24 months, and just how they get there. I think is going to be the interesting piece in what has become again a really competitive market quickly. You've answered a bit of the question I'm going to ask next, but around that investable metal, when you're assessing, the lessors that you look at, how hard are you digging them where they've got wide bodies, right? Or your thoughts beyond the kind of narrow body new tech market?
Well, if you look at the lessors like AirCap and Air Lease, they both have large wide body portfolios. So, and they're both are among our highest rated aircraft lessors, the two of them. So we're not really dinging them. And I think in terms of impairment charges, I think we've probably seen the worst of them. So we haven't really been dinging them. I would say if we saw a portfolio, and this is all hypothetical, obviously, but if we saw something like 747s and A380s, that would be a negative. But I think for the most part, we haven't dinged them.
And your thoughts, and your thoughts on the cargo market, right, which has been a bright spot over the last 21 months. We've seen an increase that's held, and the question now is, will it hold, say, when belly cargo returns in long haul? But where are you thinking and will happen in that space, and is there opportunity for kind of investors within it?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that, because Avalon has that new joint venture, or the new opportunity that they're going to be investing in the A330 cargo conversions. Cargo tends to be a cyclical market. It has been booming over the last few years because of the growth in e-commerce and the shortage, as you said, of belly capacity. And then, Amazon and all the aircraft that they use. So, but in our analysis, I mean, we actually rate ATSG, and they've done a great job. They've been much ahead of our expectations, and so they've already been upgraded once. But in our analysis, we kind of think that things are going to continue to grow over the next few years. We see them more stable, and it'll be interesting to see if these growth opportunities really pan out as much as everyone's expecting by putting all these cargo aircraft into the cargo market. We've seen some new entrants there. And so it'll be interesting to see how things play out. I think the larger, more established cargo operators should continue to do well. But again, this is a market where there's a lot of new entrants there, putting in a lot of cargo capacity, and we'll see what happens.
Any thoughts around likelihood of a cargo ABS, or thoughts on how receptive the market would be to it?
Actually, there was a cargo ABS done, I think in 2019. We didn't rate it. It was
the VX, I think, was
yes.
it was a pre-COVID one.
Right. I don't know if we've seen any requests for cargo ones yet. or more recently, I should say. I know we haven't rated any, but there could be some.
I can ask more broadly on investors. We talked about some of the new money that's come at the space, Betsy. Your thoughts on the makeup of that? Is it the same type of investors? So obviously the parties change, but private equity, Chinese capital, maybe not as much. Japanese capital still seems interested. Your thoughts on trends post-COVID on the type of capital, and there is still lots of it coming at the space. Any of it surprised you?
Yeah, I think that, well, the Chinese, I wasn't surprised by that because everyone, for the last few years, people had been expecting that with the situation in China, that there would be less investment, and certainly with the H&A situation. And there was, in fact, I'm somewhat surprised that there has been more consolidation among the Chinese lessors than we've seen. The Japanese have been really very active in this space. You look at the leasing companies that they've owned, and they're using them for other opportunities like JALCO financings and things like that. In terms of the in the U.S., we've seen obviously with Carlyle buying Fly and their plans to grow that business, and then Castle Lake with their new financing that they did, and they hope to increase their portfolio. Both of those have been very active in aircraft financing over the last several years. So it's not a new space for them. But then you see companies like Merck's growing their portfolio, and I think it's also also have some new entrants like Griffin, and it will be interesting to see what companies like that do. So I think that there's still going to be demand there from new entrants, private equity, and companies like that.
Yeah, no, fully agreed. Right, and as you say, the likes of Apollo, BlackRock, Bain, they're backing it in a very big way, and it looks like they'll continue to do that. Just in closing, Betsy, as you look out into 2022 and at the broader space, particularly on aviation finance, how optimistic or not are you about the sector?
For aviation finance, if they could survive what we went through, I'm feeling pretty optimistic. So after the worst, and I know everyone always says unprecedented, but in this case, it's true. I mean, I've been around long enough. I went through 9/11. I went through the financial crisis, but it's never been anything like this. And it's also been on a global basis, which we haven't really seen before. And so if they could survive this, I feel pretty good about this sector.
No, well, listen, on that optimistic note, and I agree with you, if you can winter this, you can summer anything, right? So, Betsy, I'd like to thank you as always for your time and insights, and wish you and S&P all the best over 2022.
Same to you, and hopefully we'll be together in person at some point.
I'm fingers crossed this is our last virtual one of these, Betsy. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.